Yeah, well, right. All right, everyone, let's get us started. Thank you. So first of all, thank you for being here today for Lifespan Institute Research Rising Colloquium. We do have people online. I'm hoping that they can hear me. If not, let me know. Probably a really minor request there. But I'm delighted to be able to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Shulamite Green, who's coming to us from UCLA. Dr. Green is an assistant professor and Friends of the Semel Institute Endowed Term Chair in Translational Mental Health Research. It's a long title. She completed her doctoral training in clinical psychology at UCLA before doing her clinical internship at the Children's Hospital in Los Angeles, and then returned back to UCLA for her postdoctoral work. She is, within her career, she's had multiple notable achievements, including from the International Society for Autism Research, who has awarded her with the Slivka Ritvo Innovation in Autism Award, as well as their Distinguished Dissertation Research Award back in 2015. So those are both impressive accomplishments. Perhaps more impressively, Dr. Green has been funded by NIH at each stage of her career. So she's actually someone who has competed successfully for an F-31, an F-32, a K-08, and an R-1. So really impressive stuff. It's kind of the model of what we all aspire to, but very few of us figure out that formula. Her publications have been very diverse. That is using separate methodologies, including psychophys, neuroimaging, quantitative behavioral assessment, and she publishes regularly in high impact journals, including JAMA Psychiatry, American Journal of Psychiatry, Cerebral Cortex, and Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry. Notable also in there, many of her publications are first authored by or co-authored by her students, which shows really her dedication to mentorship and training as well. Her research is focused on sensory issues, specifically in autism spectrum disorder, as well as their underlying neurobiology. For those of us who study or work with people with autism, we know that sensory issues can be very distressing, very challenging for many different individuals, but also really difficult to study and difficult to measure. So for years, they were really understudied in this population, poorly understood, and our ability to support individuals and families with these experiences have been limited. That has begun to shift within our field, and I really see Dr. Green as being an emerging leader in pushing this field forward and addressing really important questions. So she's going to talk to us today about her work in sensory processing in autism and underlying neurobiology. So welcome, please join me in welcoming Dr. Shulamite Green.
Thank you. That was such a nice introduction. I don't even need to give the talk anymore. Like you already set me up perfectly, so I appreciate it. Thank you so much for inviting me here. It's such a pleasure to be here. Everybody I've talked to today has just been so nice. This is such a collaborative environment. So I'm just really, really thrilled to be here and meet all of you. I'm hoping that this is all working in terms of Zoom and people being able to see me. So if anything is not working, I hope, fingers crossed, let me know. So as Matt said, I'm going to be talking about my work on the neurobiological basis of sensory processing atypicalities in autism and a little bit in some other neurodevelopmental conditions as well. Something that's really important to me is really integrating my background both as a neuroscientist and as a clinical psychologist. So even when I'm designing kind of more basic neuroscience studies, I always have an eye towards how can these inform intervention. So that's kind of the from neuroscience to intervention piece. And so I am going to be talking about that today, is how do we take these neuroscience studies and start translating them into interventions and actually improving people's lives. So I'm going to be talking to you about sensory processing today. And sensory processing is a really core component of how we interpret and navigate our world. So how we process and regulate our responses to sensory information. I think most of us often take this for granted. But if it goes wrong, it can make life really, really hard. So you're probably not noticing right now, like the feeling of the chair you're sitting in, or your clothes on your body, or, the sound of the clock ticking in the background, because your brain just kind of takes in all of those different sensory inputs and it's able to adapt to these ongoing inputs in order to pay attention to more novel stimuli, like hopefully right now, the sound of my voice. So for individuals with sensory overresponsivity, however, they may continue to attend to all of these incoming stimuli, leading to this feeling of overwhelm and too much information. And so there are many, many types of altered sensory processing in autism and in other neurodevelopmental conditions. But what I'm going to be focusing on today, for the most part, is sensory overresponsivity, because that is usually what people talk about as being the most impairing and the most kind of challenging to everyday life. And it's also the most prevalent across different neurodevelopmental conditions. So sensory overresponsivity is this experience of really being overly sensitive to or overreactive to kind of everyday sensations. So that could be things like loud noises, it could be scratchy materials or bright lights. And this is most commonly studied. People are most aware of this within autism. It's extremely prevalent in autism with rates up to 70% or higher. But it's also highly prevalent in other conditions like ADHD, like anxiety disorders, fetal alcohol syndrome, early life adversity, and children who are born preterm. So to give you a sense of how it feels, I'm going to give you a few quotes from some individuals with sensory overresponsivity. It feels like my brain is on fire. It's too much. You feel so sick, anxious, helpless, panicked. You can't tune out whatever noises you're hearing. They're just way too loud and they constantly go on and on. So as I'm sure you can imagine from these quotes, sensory overresponsivity can make life really hard. It can interfere with school and work performance. It can interfere with social interactions, with daily life activities and independent living skills. And it's also associated with more mental health challenges like anxiety, depression, and behavioral problems. When I started working in this field almost 20 years ago, families of children on the spectrum, clinicians working with children on the spectrum, they all knew that sensory overresponsivity was a problem, but there was almost no research on this topic. That's why I have this big blank screen to kind of show that it was like this big kind of blank box. We just didn't know anything. So for example, we had no idea whether kids who had sensory overresponsivity, do they actually experience sounds as louder? Or does the same volume of sound just bother them more? So we didn't know what caused it. We didn't really know how to treat it very well. So what I want to do today is share some of the research areas that I think are necessary to understand and treat this impairing aspect of many neurodevelopmental conditions. And I want to preface this by saying this is not an exhaustive list of everything that we need to study about sensory processing. These are kind of the areas that I've been focusing on and that I plan to focus on in the future, but there are other things as well. So first and foremost, I'm really interested in what are the neural mechanisms underlying sensory overresponsivity. I think that will help us understand what this actually is and give us some more clues how to treat it. So that's what I've focused a lot of my work on. That's what I'm going to spend the most time talking about today. I'm also really interested in taking a developmental perspective. How does sensory processing and sort of the way we regulate our sensory responses, how does this develop, both at the neural level and at the behavioral level? And what does this tell us about the timing of interventions? Speaking of which, how can we intervene better? We need more evidence-based treatments for individuals with sensory overresponsivity. Generalizability is really important. So as we start thinking about these things, the different neural mechanisms, developmental course, is that true for everybody who experiences sensory overresponsivity, or is it different in ADHD, for example, compared to in autism? I also think that it's important to think about how this generalizes across the autism spectrum and make sure we're not leaving out kids or individuals who are on the more severe end of the spectrum. Also thinking about like girls and gender diverse individuals with autism and making sure that we're generalizing our research in that way. Measurement, how can we measure these sensory processing difficulties? And this kind of relates to generalizability. How do we measure them across different populations and across the spectrum? And how does sensory overresponsivity and other types of sensory processing differences relate to other symptoms like mental health symptoms like other core symptoms of autism, such as social impairments? And actually, this is the one area that when I started, there was a little bit of research on. So I'm going to like fill in that bubble a little bit to show that. But the one thing we knew when I started out was that sensory overresponsivity was highly related to anxiety. And I thought that was really interesting. And that was actually one of the inspirations for some of the imaging work that I started doing, because I was wondering, okay, is there some sort of similar neural basis here? Why do we see these things co-occurring so much? And I'm going to put arrows between all of these because these are not kind of independent areas. They all interrelate to each other. So beyond being just an impairing and prevalent symptom, atypical sensory reactivity may actually play an important early developmental role in the development of autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions. So I'm going to give you kind of a conceptual framework for how I think about sensory processing in terms of the emergence of autism. And this is a theory, but I think there's some decent evidence to back this up. So there's emerging theories suggesting that the social deficits that we often associate with autism may not be primary, but they may rather be downstream results of more general alterations in brain development, sensory motor functioning, and attention from the prenatal period through the first year of life. And so many of the genes associated with autism, first of all, they're not genes encoding for complex social behaviors. These are genes that affect very basic aspects of neural development, such as cell adhesion or synapse formation. And these genes are expressed in the prenatal period or very early during the first year of life. And then again, the first behavioral differences we start to see are not the complex social and language symptoms that we often associate, but they're these differences in attention, sensory, and motor behaviors. So we start to see a decline in attention to faces between 2 and 6 months in infants later diagnosed with autism. We start to see some differences in white matter organization around the same period. In the second half of the first year of life, we start to see that some babies who go on to have autism have some sensory motor delays or differences as well. And then the idea is that all of these kind of this basic alterations in neural development may affect some of these early sort of sensory motor and attentional processes through which infants experience the world, which in turn affect our experience-dependent kind of strengthening of social brain networks. So that in the second year of life, that's when we may start to see some of these, that's when we do see these more classic symptoms of autism, like difficulty with friendships, with peer relationships, with pretend play, things like that. So this is just kind of a conceptual framework for thinking about the emergence of these sensory difficulties, with very much with the idea that they seem to emerge really, really early in life and really affect the earliest kind of brain development. Before I get into my research, I want to share a little bit about my lab. So my lab is called the Sensory, Cognitive, and Affective Neurodevelopment Lab. I'm sure you can tell from that title, it's very interdisciplinary, very multi-method. I primarily use imaging, including MRI, fMRI, and magnetic resonance spectroscopy to measure GABA and other kind of neurochemistry in the brain. But I also use physiology, such as heart rate and skin conductance, a lot of behavior, including some standardized sensory assessments in the lab. And then I'm really interested in kind of using all of these to look at developmental processes, as well as to inform both behavioral and psychopharmacological treatments. So as I mentioned, I'm going to spend the most time talking about these neural mechanisms. So that's where I'm going to start today. And I want to talk about kind of 3 areas or 3 main questions that I've been addressing. So one is just, again, starting from this place of knowing really very little about sensory overresponsivity. What are the neural mechanisms underlying sensory overresponsivity and sensory reactivity? How does sensory overresponsivity impact the neural processing of social information? And then what are the neural mechanisms of sensory regulation, or how we actually regulate our sensory responses? So I'll start off here. Knowing that everybody may have different levels of kind of experience and comfort with the brain, I just want to orient you to some of the different brain regions I'm going to be talking about. Let me see if I can, yes, move the mouse. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about the amygdala, which is a region of the brain that is responsible for, it's often known as kind of threat and anxiety responses, but it also plays an important role in just attention and salience attribution. I'll be talking about, I'm just gonna, the thalamus, which is a sensory relay station. It kind of sends sensory inputs to the relevant regions of the cortex. But I will also be talking about it in terms of its role in integrating and inhibiting sensory information. Over here on the right, you can see different regions of primary sensory cortex. So I'll be talking about visual cortex, auditory cortex, and somatosensory cortex, where you process tactile sensations, and also prefrontal cortex, which plays an important role in emotional and behavioral regulation. So a big part of my early work was just kind of trying to understand the basic neural mechanisms of what's happening when kids with autism are processing aversive sensory stimuli. So I conducted a series of studies where we looked at how kids with and without autism experienced aversive auditory, tactile, and visual stimuli in the scanner, often trying to use the type of stimuli that really bother them in real life, things like scratchy fabrics, loud, annoying traffic sounds, bright lights. And so we just had kids kind of passively experience these sensations while they were in the scanner. But what's exciting, I'm really into replicating data. So what's really exciting is that across all of these different studies, with different participants using totally different types of stimuli, we actually see pretty consistent results. So you can see here some results from a study where we looked at auditory and tactile stimulation. And you can see on the top are the typically developing kids, and on the bottom are kids with autism. It looks like they are responding more. And in fact, we do see pretty consistent hyperactivation in autism compared to typical development. So this is the statistical comparison on the bottom. And so we see hyperactivation in a number of different brain regions, but particularly we see some sensory cortex, auditory cortex, as well as regions involved in salience, attribution, and attention, like the amygdala and the insula over here. But this is kind of a big average, just like looking across all of these kids with autism. But I'm sure everybody here knows that there's a lot of variability within autism. One of my favorite sayings is, if you've seen one child with autism, you've seen one child with autism, because there's so much heterogeneity within the condition. So you might have one kid who's really, really sensitive to loud sounds and bright lights, and another one who really likes doing this. Or you might have the same kid who has different responses in different contexts or environments. So to understand this variability, I've kind of been honing in on what is going on in the brains of children with autism who have high sensory overresponsivity versus those who do not. And so just to give you an example of how this might break down, this is from one of our studies. We have about 50% of the kids have high sensory overresponsivity based on a standardized composite of different parent report measures. So 0 is the mean, whereas about half of the group has sensory overresponsivity more comparable to the typically developing kids. And since I mentioned before this high overlap with anxiety, I want to show you that as well. So based on parent report on the scared, we did find, and we usually find, that our group with sensory overresponsivity has significantly higher anxiety symptoms, whereas the group with no sensory overresponsivity looked much more comparable to the typically developing kids. So I really wanted to know, does severity of sensory overresponsivity relate to that neural hyperactivation that we were seeing earlier? And so the answer is yes. Give it away. So we found that children who are rated by their parents as having higher sensory overresponsivity, they have stronger activation in the amygdala, and they have stronger activation in auditory cortex and in somatosensory cortex. So it does seem like severity of sensory overresponsivity relates to how strong the neural response is to these aversive sensory information. So this suggests that to some extent, sensory overresponsivity may be related to overarousal or increased reactivity to sensory stimuli. But that's not the full story. So I've really particularly been interested in the amygdala because of its overlap with anxiety, because of its role in attention and salience attribution, and because we consistently see that it's hyperactivating in response to these sensory stimuli. So I wanted to look at habituation in the amygdala. So how does amygdala response change over time across this 8.5-minute scan period that kids are experiencing aversive auditory and tactile stimulation? And this kind of goes along with that theory I was mentioning earlier. If you are continuing to attend to all of these incoming stimuli, you can't filter anything out, that's going to make your environment feel very overwhelming. So the pattern of response in typically developing children is pretty much what we'd expect. They show an initial amygdala response to this novel stimulus, and then their amygdala response goes down pretty quickly. The children with autism who had low or no sensory overresponsivity look really similar to the typically developing group. They also have pretty fast amygdala habituation. But the children with autism with high sensory overresponsivity had a very interesting pattern. Their amygdala went down and then it went up again, as if they can't maintain this habituation over time. So interestingly, there were no group differences in initial response. It was really only over time that you see these significant differences. So that suggests that sensory overresponsivity may be less about having this initial kind of threat or like startle response, and more about this inability to adapt to stimuli over time. And so that would kind of lead to this feeling of sensory overload or too much information, or people saying my brain is on fire. Yeah, it kind of looks like your brain is on fire. So I can understand why you'd say that. So this idea of kind of attention and sort of salience attribution led me to look into what's called an intrinsic brain network known as the salience network. So this is a network that's thought to be really important in how we prioritize attention when there are many incoming stimuli. So you can imagine this person sitting there trying to pay attention to their book, and there's all of these other environmental noises going on. The salience network is thought to be important in terms of their ability to kind of attend to what they're reading in the book and filter out, pay less attention to some of these other stimuli. So the salience network is a resting state network. And what that means is that when we look at people's brains at rest, so here they're in the scanner and they're just looking at a crosshair. So they're not taking in any information. But even at rest, there are kind of these natural fluctuations in how different regions of your brain activate up and down. And we see that in, consistently across different conditions, across adults, across children, even infants, there are these consistent patterns of fluctuation. And these we think of as kind of these intrinsic brain network or resting state networks. Sorry, something popped up on my screen, but I think we're good. And so this network, known as the salience network, not only is it important to attention and salience attribution, but it has shown to have atypical connectivity in autism. So this is from a paper by Lucina Udin, who found that children with autism show hyperconnectivity in the salience network. And actually, of all of the different resting state brain networks that we see, the salience network kind of showed the most differentiation between children with autism and typically developing children. And this network has a hub in the anterior insula right there. So what I wanted to know was, does salience network connectivity relate to sensory overresponsivity? So what I found, I looked at this within a group of children with autism. And what I found was that children who had higher levels of sensory overresponsivity showed greater salience network connectivity with primary sensory cortices like somatosensory cortex and auditory cortex, and with the amygdala. So this suggests that even at rest, individuals with autism and with high sensory overresponsivity, they kind of be primed to pay greater attention to primary sensory processing of tactile and auditory stimuli. And so, this is a theory. When we do these resting state studies, we can kind of theorize. Remember, this is not during information processing. This is just someone staring at a crosshair. So we can kind of theorize what this might mean for information processing. But I wanted to take it a step further and actually directly relate this to how kids respond to the aversive sensory stimuli. So what I did was correlate these resting state patterns with their response to sensory stimuli. So here, this is the correlation between the strength of connectivity between the salience network or the right anterior insula hub and the amygdala, and how that correlates with their amygdala response during auditory and tactile processing. And there was a significant correlation between those two things. And similarly, kids who had stronger salience network connectivity with somatosensory cortex had stronger somatosensory activation during auditory and tactile sensory processing. So first of all, this adds some validation to resting state studies. This suggests that these brain activation patterns we see at rest actually do relate to how the brain responds to information. And this is also consistent with the idea that basic sensory stimuli are over-salient to individuals with sensory over-responsivity, leading them to attribute too much attention to this extraneous sensory stimuli and potentially kind of at the detriment of paying attention to more relevant social stimuli. So that's what I'm going to talk about next, is I tested this directly. What is the impact of sensory overresponsivity or sensory distraction on brain responses to social information processing? So to test this, I used a social cognition task with kids with and without autism while they were in the scanner. I should have mentioned that these kids are ages 8 to 17, so it's a pretty big age range. 8 is around the age we can kind of get consistent, good low motion data with kids in the scanner. So while the kids are in the scanner, they see this setup for a little story. An example here, John and Linda want to go swimming at the beach. And then they get one of two possible endings to this story. So they either get a sincere ending. When they get there, the sky is blue and sunny. John says, "What a perfect day." Or they get a sarcastic ending. When they get there, the sky turns dark and rainy. John says, "What a perfect day." And then they have to answer, did John mean what he said, yes or no? So it's kind of a basic social inference task. They're deciding if he was sincere or sarcastic. But half of the time we rubbed their wrist with this scratchy fabric, and that was our sensory distractor. So this task has been used before, and we know from a number of prior studies that children with autism can complete this task with really good accuracy. But they tend to show greater brain activation while doing so, particularly in auditory language regions and regions important to social information processing. And that is thought to mean that they're kind of extending more effort to get to the same high level of accuracy. And we saw that here as well. We saw greater activation just while doing the task with no sensory distraction. But what we really wanted to know is what happens when we add this sensory distraction. So when we added the sensory distraction, we saw significant decreases in all of these really important auditory language and social information processing regions. And we saw that decrease happen significantly more in children with autism compared to typically developing children. So this suggests that the children with autism are kind of overwhelmed by this tactile sensation. Maybe they're already at peak effort before you add this sensory distraction, and it just kind of creates too much of a distraction and they can't sustain that already more effortful processing in those key regions of the brain. So far I've talked about atypical sensory reactivity and ways in which it can detract from social processing. But I'm starting to see that there's some compensatory mechanisms that may protect against sensory overresponsivity in some children and may be important to intervention. So I'm going to talk about my work so far looking at two brain regions that seem to play an important role in sensory regulation. So one is the prefrontal cortex and one is the thalamus. So we know from the emotion regulation literature that the prefrontal cortex plays a really important role in down-regulating amygdala responses. So I wanted to see if that same process might be happening with sensory processing as well. So I looked at how functional connectivity with the amygdala changes when children are experiencing aversive sensations compared to when they're not. So I used something called a psychophysiological interaction analysis. So you can see how kind of amygdala activation and the way it correlates with other regions of the brain. How does this change when they are experiencing a sensory stimuli compared to when they're not? And what I found was there were significant group differences in connectivity with this orbital frontal region of the prefrontal cortex. But again, I'm less interested in just these basic diagnostic group differences and more interested in sensory overresponsivity. So I broke that down into kids with and without sensory overresponsivity. So in blue here, you can see the group with autism that has no or low sensory overresponsivity. And they show this pattern of significant negative connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And that's a pattern that we usually associate with downregulation of the amygdala, because as prefrontal activation goes up, amygdala activation goes down. The group with autism in green that has high sensory overresponsivity didn't show any of that significant negative connectivity. And neither did the typically developing group here in red, although they're also not overactivating amygdala at all, so they may not really need to regulate their response. So this suggests that children with autism who have low sensory overresponsivity, who remember behaviorally they look like the typically developing group. These are not the kids having meltdowns. They're not the kids covering their ears or refusing to wear certain types of clothing. So behaviorally they look typical in terms of their sensory processing, but their neural responses look different. So they may kind of be using more effortful regulatory strategies by engaging prefrontal cortex in order to not show those same sensory overresponsive behaviors. So this can kind of give us some hints as to where we might want to go with intervention, and I'll talk about that a little more later. But first I want to talk about the thalamus. So I'm finding the thalamus may also play an important role in sensory reactivity and regulation. So I found that one particular region of the thalamus, kind of in the back of the thalamus, known as the pulvinar, was showing some hyperactivation to this aversive sensory stimulation. And we know that the pulvinar plays an important role in integrating and inhibiting sensory information through inputs from the cortex, as opposed to some other areas of the thalamus, which are kind of more routing to the cortex. So again, I looked at functional connectivity with the pulvinar and how that changed during sensory stimulation compared to rest. And what I found was that if you look up at the top here, in typically developing children, there were a lot of changes in pulvinar thalamic connectivity with a number of different cortical regions, which suggests that typically developing children are modulating and inhibiting their response to sensory information. That's kind of what we'd expect, is a lot of cortical input. The group with autism, on the other hand, did not show any changes in connectivity with the cortex. Instead, they're showing changes in connectivity with the amygdala. And in fact, the more they strengthened connectivity with the amygdala, the more sensory overresponsivity they had. So this suggests these cortical, kind of thalamicortical connections and inputs are really important to modulating our sensory responses. And so the fact that children with autism, and particularly those with sensory overresponsivity, aren't doing that suggests that they, instead of kind of saying, okay, these sensory inputs aren't that important, they're consistent, they're ongoing, we can kind of like dampen our response. Instead, they are like, by connectivity with the amygdala, it's almost like saying, no, pay more attention to these things instead of inhibition. So one way in which the thalamus may inhibit sensory responses is through a neurotransmitter called GABA. So I wanted to look at whether an imbalance in GABA, which is a major inhibitory neurotransmitter, to glutamate, which is a major excitatory neurotransmitter, might be related to sensory overresponsivity, as this would support this idea that the thalamus is not inhibiting sensory information the way it should be. So to do this, I use something called magnetic resonance spectroscopy, which allows us to measure levels of GABA and glutamate concentration in the thalamus. And this work was led by a former postdoctoral fellow in my lab, Dr. Emily Wood. So she measured the levels of GABA and glutamate in the thalamus of children with autism while they're in the scanner. And she did indeed find that children with higher sensory overresponsivity had lower concentrations of GABA in the thalamus, and they had lower ratios of GABA to glutamate in the thalamus. So that could help explain why, for these kids, there's too much sensory signal getting through, being routed to other regions of the brain, and just not really getting those inhibitory inputs. On the other hand, children with low levels of sensory overresponsivity had higher levels of GABA concentration. So this could be another potential compensatory mechanism or kind of regulatory mechanism that helps inhibit responses to sensory information. So far I've talked about some of the basic neural mechanisms underlying sensory reactivity, including neural hyperreactivity, reduced neural habituation, and atypical connectivity in salience and thalamic networks. And I've talked about some potential mechanisms for sensory regulation, including prefrontal downregulation of the amygdala and GABA levels in the thalamus. But so far, I've really been telling you about research across a very large age range of kids, as I said, 8 to 17, without taking into account the effect of age or development. But if you are all aware of child research, which most of you probably are in this department, you know that most processes change across development. So we can't assume that these things are just going to be static across a large age range. So a really important question is, when and how does sensory overresponsivity emerge? How does it change across development? And what can that tell us for the timing of interventions? So that's what I'm going to talk about next. So I've started a little bit looking at the relationship between very early brain development and sensory overresponsivity in collaboration with my colleague, Dr. Mirella DePreto. And I'm going to tell you about some data that was led by her former grad student, Dr. Tani Singh. So we looked at resting state data in 6-week-old babies while they were asleep. And half of the babies were at a heightened likelihood of developing autism because they had an older sibling on the autism spectrum. And half of the babies had a typical likelihood of developing autism and did not have an older sibling on the autism spectrum. And again, we looked at our good friend, the salience network with the hub in the anterior insula, which is really important for how we're kind of attributing our attention. So what we found was that even at 6 weeks of age, there were differences in salience network connectivity in these two groups. So we found that the babies with a higher likelihood of developing autism at 6 weeks old had greater salience network connectivity with sensory motor cortices and with the thalamus, whereas babies who had a typical likelihood of developing autism had greater salience network connectivity with prefrontal regions of the brain that are really important to social information processing. And we found that there was a negative correlation between these two areas of connectivity, so that babies who had greater, across the whole sample, babies who had greater connectivity with sensory motor regions had reduced connectivity with prefrontal regions. So this suggests kind of a trade-off, whereby if you are, imagine an infant developing across the first year of life, if you are strengthening those sensory motor networks more, you may not be strengthening those prefrontal networks as much, which makes sense if you think about how infants develop. Our brain development is experience dependent. So most babies spend just thousands of hours looking at faces and hearing voices and developing expertise in those things. And that sort of affects how their brain develops. But imagine if you're constantly being distracted by these extraneous sensations, maybe you can't attend as much to those things and develop that type of expertise, which is going to shape which networks in your brain are strong. So we did find that also these patterns of connectivity actually predicted behavior in the second year of life, the end of the first year. So within the typical likelihood group, babies who had greater connectivity with those prefrontal regions had greater ability to share attention on this measure called the early social communication scale. And we know that shared attention is a really important precursor to later language and social development. Whereas in the high likelihood babies, those who had greater connectivity with the amygdala and with sensory cortices had greater sensory sensitivity or sensory overresponsivity at 1 year of age. So we're already seeing differences in salience connectivity as early as 6 weeks old. It's predicting later behavior at the end of the first year of life. And the patterns we see at 6 weeks are really consistent with those patterns, if you remember, that I showed you in the older adolescents with autism and sensory overresponsivity, the same pattern of greater salience network connectivity with sensory motor or sensory regions and with amygdala. So I think that's pretty exciting. So I'm really interested in the kind of developmental perspective, and not just in infants. I want to study how these processes develop across childhood and across adolescence and into young adulthood. So I recently received an R01 from NIMH, which is looking at exactly this question. So we're examining how the neural mechanisms of sensory reactivity and regulation develop across adolescence longitudinally. And some of the kind of theory that this is based on is this idea that we see that sensory overresponsivity on average declines across adolescence and into young adulthood, but it doesn't there's a lot of variability within that. It doesn't go away for a lot of people. It continues to bother a lot of people. We also, in some preliminary data, saw that there was kind of a decrease in amygdala reactivity as kids got older, and an increase in prefrontal activation for individuals with autism as they got older. So I developed this kind of developmental theoretical model of sensory regulation. So this is just theoretical, but the idea is that, and this starts at age 8 because that's when we start scanning kids, but obviously development starts earlier than that. But the idea is that there's some typical process of developing sensory regulation. If you've interacted with typically developing toddlers or preschoolers, you know that it's really common for kids to be really scared to go into public restrooms and hear the sound of the toilet flushing, or be really picky about kind of what types of clothing they wear. We need more, there's not a lot of research on this. It's something that I'm really excited to do, but it does seem like there may be some really typical, it may be typical to have some aspects of sensory over responsivity early in development. And then there's some natural process by which that kind of goes away, which the brain learns to regulate those sensations. So you can kind of imagine maybe prefrontal regulation starts low in typically developing kids and then increases across childhood. And in theory, have it kind of peaking here around age 10, which is when we know more mature patterns of prefrontal downregulation of the amygdala start to emerge. But maybe in children with autism, we don't see that same, maybe we see delayed development. So in dark blue here, I have this group of ASD high regulators who eventually develop that prefrontal regulation, but they really don't start to show those increases until later in adolescence. So that where typically developing kids may actually be declining in effortful prefrontal engagement, because when regulation becomes overlearned and easy and subconscious, you don't need as much effortful prefrontal regulation. At the same time, this group of kids with autism are actually ramping that up. And so later in adolescence, maybe that's why you might actually see greater prefrontal responses in the group with autism compared to the typically developing kids. But maybe there's another group of kids with autism who I call the low regulators who don't develop that at all. And those might be the people who into young adulthood are still saying this is really bothering me. So what's really exciting is I now have some data that actually fits with this theoretical model. So the data I'm going to show you is cross-sectional. We're still working on the longitudinal data. But what we found is that, again, cross-sectionally, within kids with autism, age correlates with greater prefrontal responses to aversive auditory and tactile stimulation. So as the kids who are older are showing more orbital frontal and medial prefrontal responses in the scanner compared to the younger kids with autism. We actually see the opposite pattern in the typically developing kids, where age is negatively related to medial prefrontal activation. So the younger typically developing kids are showing more prefrontal responses, and as they get older, they're showing fewer prefrontal responses. And this here is just showing there's a significant difference between the two groups. And when you plot it, it turns out it's actually a non-linear relationship, which looks very excitingly like my model. So that's really, it's always nice when the data bear out what you think they're going to. So the orange here is the typically developing kids. This is the orbital frontal cortex, and you can see that they're kind of increasing here into early adolescence, and then orbital frontal activation actually goes down as they get older. Whereas the kids with autism are showing what looks like almost a delayed pattern, where they're not increasing that orbital frontal activation until later in adolescence. So by the time you get to late adolescence, they actually show more prefrontal responses. Okay, so now I'm going to move somewhat out of the realm of established work and into future directions. So I'm starting, as I said, to design imaging studies in a way that can directly inform interventions. It's kind of like, I think of it as like pre-intervention work, kind of proof of mechanism work. Let's show that these things affect the neurobiological mechanisms involved in sensory overresponsivity, and then we can develop them into interventions. So my R01 that I mentioned, in addition to just kind of tracking brain development over time, we're also looking at whether we can engage it in maybe younger kids or in kids who are not doing it on their own. So we're testing out 2 potential interventions adapted from the emotion regulation literature. So one of these is attentional redirection. And that's using verbal cues to shift attention away from sensory stimuli and towards key social cues. And the other one is reappraisal, which trains individuals to think about the stimuli differently. In this case, we use a reporter analogy to kind of help younger kids get into it. So we teach them to describe the sensation in a more objective way, like a news reporter would, rather than thinking about how it makes them feel. So kind of, as I said, these ideas, these theories come straight from like the cognitive behavioral therapy literature. So if they work in addressing some of the neurobiological mechanisms, it would actually be pretty low-hanging fruit to start adapting them into cognitive behavioral interventions. So I'll give you an example of one of these. So with some preliminary data we have. So for the attentional redirection, if you remember this social cognition task that I showed you, where kids had to decide if the person speaking was sincere or sarcastic. And we saw that with the sensory distraction, there were all of these reductions in some of these key brain responses. So we used attentional redirection, and it was really, really basic. We just told kids to pay attention to the tone of the voice and the look on the face. And just saying that completely changed their brain responses. So we no longer saw any decreases in brain activity, even with the addition of the tactile distraction. And instead we saw this kind of upregulation or increase in activation in medial prefrontal cortex. So something about that attentional redirection allowed them to use regulatory regions such as medial prefrontal cortex to sustain processing in these important social and language processing regions of the brain. So it could be that, you know, if you're just overwhelmed by all of these different incoming sensory sensation, if you can just give them a clue as to where to focus your attention, maybe it kind of decreases effort a little bit. So these adapted CBT interventions, I kind of think of again as like a low-hanging fruit, but I also think that it's going to be really effortful. These types of interventions are effortful, and you kind of need to have higher cognitive and language abilities to engage in them. So I think we need other interventions as well. So towards that end, I have funding from the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation and from INSAR to test a beta blocker for propranolol in terms of its effect on the neural mechanisms underlying sensory overresponsivity in kids with autism. So this could lead to a clinical trial if it works. I also have funding from the Eagles Foundation to look at similarly the effect of transcranial magnetic stimulation on some of these same neural mechanisms. In this study, that's with autistic adults who have sensory overresponsivity. So I kind of see these approaches as complementary. So a beta blocker would kind of address some of the bottom-up mechanisms of like that over-arousal, over-reactivity, whereas transcranial magnetic stimulation, we're stimulating prefrontal cortex. So that kind of might engage some of these regulatory processes. I've been talking about autism this whole time, but sensory overresponsivity is not specific to autism. We see it across all of these different neurodevelopmental conditions. And I'm interested in understanding more about whether these neurobiological mechanisms are similar or different across conditions, because we need to know whether we can use the same treatments or not. We can't assume because something works for autism that it's going to work for everybody else. So I'm just going to give you a very small taste of kind of where I'm going in this area. So I've started looking at both children with anxiety disorders and children with early caregiving adversity, both of whom show really high levels of sensory overresponsivity. So here you can see children with anxiety disorders. They're not quite as high as the autism group, but they're a lot higher than the typical developing group in terms of their SOR severity. This is a study I did looking at two groups of adopted children. So the children in dark blue here are children adopted from international institutions, and the children in green here are adopted from domestic foster care. They have really diverse range of kind of early adverse experiences, but both groups show this similar very high level of sensory overresponsivity compared to this non-adopted group. So then we looked at what were their neural responses to aversive sensory stimulation. Both groups show neural hyperactivation to sensory stimulation. The kids with anxiety actually show patterns that look kind of analogous to the kids with autism. The group of kids adopted from foster care had hyperactivation, but it was really in these much more circumscribed regions like somatosensory cortex, as opposed to the much more widespread what we see in autism. So this is just kind of like a little taste, but I'm really interested in kind of understanding why that might be. Is there some sort of resilience mechanism going on in this group? And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is measurement. I never thought I would be a measurement person. This was not really my training background. But there are just so few good measures of sensory overresponsivity out there that it's just, you have to address measurement if you're going to be in this area. This also relates to the generalizability question. If we want to study broader populations, including younger kids or kids more severely affected, we can't just use MRI. There are a lot of kids, a lot of individuals who can't do MRI. So I'm really interested in how we can use physiological measures to study sensory overresponsivity. We can measure heart rate on children with just 2 stickers on their torso. So way less invasive and difficult than sitting through an hour of MRI. And I found that heart rate in particular seems to be sensitive to sensory overresponsivity. So this is looking at a period of multiple trials of aversive tactile and auditory stimulation. And you can see in dark, in black here is kids with autism who have high sensory overresponsivity, and they show significantly greater heart rate increases compared to their baseline, compared to either typically developing kids or those with autism and low sensory overresponsivity. But it gets even more interesting if you kind of look at a second by second level. So this is looking across kind of the 15 seconds of a stimulus trial. And this is using something called interbeat interval. So on the y-axis is the amount of time between heartbeats. So higher interbeat interval actually means slower heart rate because you have longer time between heartbeats. And a lower interbeat interval actually means a faster heart rate. So typically developing individuals, a typical response to a novel stimulus is actually to slow your heart rate down. So that's what you see here in the typically developing group. That's called an orienting response. And that's thought to kind of give you a beat to process the basic properties of a stimulus. So for example, you can decide if it's a threat or not. Do you need to go into fight or flight mode or not? And then it's normal to accelerate heart rate a little bit after that. In kids with autism who have sensory overresponsivity, we see a dampened orienting response. So they're not slowing their heart rate as much, and then they accelerate much faster. So it almost seems like they're not taking that beat to process the stimulus, they're just going right into fight or flight mode immediately. So this was one of the inspirations for that beta blocker study I mentioned, because that can really dampen this autonomic response. Maybe if we can give kids that kind of beat to process the stimulus, they won't go into fight or flight mode so quickly. But I think it also shows promise for using something really kind of simple and generalizable, like a heart rate monitor that kids could just wear throughout their daily life to kind of measure their sensory overresponsivity. And finally, just coming back full circle to where we started, I am still really interested in how sensory overresponsivity relates to other symptoms like sleep, like anxiety, like social functioning. And so that's just an area that kind of cuts across everything that I do. So with that, I just want to acknowledge all my funding sources. There are many, many kids and families who participate in these studies, and I'm really grateful for their time, as well as my collaborators and everyone in my lab.
Thank you, Shula, for that. It's fantastic. That data in there. So we'll open up to questions, but before we do, I'm going to be selfish and ask the first question. So one of the things that was curious, I think it was one of your initial slides and early data sets, was documenting hyperactivation within different sensory cortical areas, but it seemed like you were collapsing across, say, tactile or some sensory feedback and auditory.
Yes, that's a really, yes.
One of the things that is so fascinating about that, though, is, or in autism generally, in terms of sensory experiences within individuals clinically, right? Like they may show really heightened responses to auditory inputs, but then they'll put their hand on the stove and just not even flinch, right? And so it's like, are you conceptualizing this as a generalized sort of hyperreactivity of all sensory cortices, or how are you thinking about?
How much time do I have to answer this question?
40 minutes.
It's a really, really good question. But also I could talk about that for a very long time. So first of all, we have looked at individual responses to individual, like tactile alone, auditory alone, and both together. I didn't really have enough time to go through that, but interestingly, the patterns are similar. We just see more overactivation when both are together. So I've kind of been focusing on that because I think it it just better represents our real life experiences. Where like we rarely experience just one modality of sensory stimulation at a time. I personally don't think, I don't know, this might be controversial, but like, I sort of think that like what's going on is more central, like is not specific to a particular sensory modality. So how do we explain all this heterogeneity? Okay, I really want to, so I have a slide I want to show you.
Go for it.
Okay, so you said, you made this point like, okay, somebody might be really over responsive to loud sounds, but then they'll go put their hand on the stove. It gets even more specific than that, right? You can have kids who are like really over responsive to like their scratchy clothes and they'll go put their hand on their stove. So even within a sensory modality, it might be. So I do have this kind of cool finding that I feel like I want to follow up on more, but people ask me a lot about, let me see if I can pull this up.
You just gotta scroll
Oh
up.
no, what did I do?
This is the worst. This is bad sensory experience. Computers don't trust you yet.
Okay, so people ask me a lot about like, this is not getting at the heterogeneity of different modalities, but it's getting at this idea of like, why do you show over responsivity to some things and under responsivity to other things? So I showed you our habituation data, but what I didn't really have time to show you is that after, and I was like hoping somebody would ask about this so I could pull this up, but so after they're experiencing these aversive auditory and tactile stimuli, we actually gave them slightly different auditory and tactile stimuli to look at generalization of response. So they're like different enough that you can tell they're different, but they're just like another frequency of white noise, another different type of scratchy material. And we were really interested in generalizability. So like your habituation response should happen more quickly. But I feel like what we found is even a little bit more complex than that. So I'll just show you really quickly. So typically developing children, again, so this is just to show you, this is exactly the same at this point. So it's just to show you the change from like the end of the habituation period and then the first half of the new stimuli and the second half of the new stimuli. So typically developing children do exactly what you'd expect is they show a little bit of increase in response and then it goes back down again. But the children with autism with low sensory over-responsivity show no increase in response at all. And the children with autism with high sensory over-responsivity, also, they're already high and they just stay high. So both groups don't show any change in response to this new stimulus. And I feel like that could look like under-responsivity, right? But it's like you could get to under-responsivity from two different places. You can either get to under-responsivity because you're already kind of at peak reactivity and you can't go up anymore. Or you could get there because maybe you're like over-regulating your response and dampening it. So I feel like that could be one mechanism why we might see both over and under responsivity in the same kids in two different contexts. I don't know if that could translate to two different modalities or not, but I think it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's complex.
Yeah.
Other questions? When you take questions, I'm gonna pull up the Zoom people.
Does that low SOR for ASD also include under responsive?
I get so that is like a key point. So the over responsive group is also more under responsive. They have significantly more under responsivity. So the groups don't divide evenly. It's and other papers and other groups have shown this is that it's kind of like kids who have more sensory dysregulation just have more sensory dysregulation. And if you're more severe, you're severe in all of these modalities. Or it seems like it divides between like kids who are severe and show like all of these, they also show sensory seeking, kids who are maybe mild or don't have any sensory processing issues. And then there's a sort of in-between group, and the in-between more moderate, they might show more selective sensory processing difficulty. But the kids who are most severe seem to like show under responsivity and over responsivity and so that's why I think it's almost more of this like sensory dysregulation, this like inability to regulate and modulate your sensory responses.
I'll just say that people on Zoom, we can see you now, or see your icons, whatever, your names. So if you have questions, please feel free to raise your virtual hand or to unmute and ask. Go to Nancy.
Yeah, I have a basic question. So How are you measuring the sensory sensitive? Is it a rating scale?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So again, like I'm now becoming a measurement person. I really wanted to. So most of the data that I've shown you today is based on parent report. So there's a rating scale and it asks them, which of these things bother your child, and they can kind of rate them and check them off. There are, I feel like, again, another thing I could talk about for an hour. So we also use an observed measure of sensory overresponsivity. So we have a standardized lab task where we present kids with different types of sensory information and we code their responses, like if they grimace, if they, cover their ears, things like that. So we recently published on this and we showed that like, yeah, it works. Like you do get kids with autism show a lot more sensory overresponsivity on this measure compared to typically developing kids. It has no correlation with parent report. And everybody who looks at this finds the same thing. So it's not just us. Consistently, people find very little relationship between parent report and these standardized observed measures of sensory behavior. So there are a lot of reasons that could be. It could be that we have bad measures. That's one option. It could also be that like parents are viewing their kids across lots of different environments. And it's more of like a trait versus we're looking at more of a state. It could be that it's this standardized lab task with kids who already we've gained their trust. They've gotten to know us. They know we're not going to torture them with anything too horrible. So I'm pretty sure there are a lot of kids who are regulating their responses, meaning that they may not particularly like what were, these sensory sensations, but they're not like outwardly showing this. And so one of the things I'm starting to do is see if we can combine physiology with observed responses, and can we even get a sense of like which kids are better regulators if there's a mismatch, like if they have high heart rate but they're not showing behavior versus kids who have low heart rate and not showing behavior. Maybe those are different kids. Maybe those are the kids who are showing more prefrontal downward. So I don't know. This is like an open question. We have to figure out how to measure this better. Yeah.
One question just related to that one.
Yeah.
So how distinct are your high and low SOR groups?
Yes.
Like, are they really like, can you define a threshold that has?
So we tried to do this with our
sensitivity and
paper
specificity?
too, for like what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
So we tried to use like we tried all these different statistical methods. So like we looked at our standardized observed task, and we looked at like, okay, can we use a 2 standard deviation cutoff, or can we look at typical responses and show like a certain amount above that? The problem is, again, I think with our observed task, there might be a lot of kids who just aren't showing the behaviors, even though they dislike it. So again, that's a measurement issue. It's like the difference between an over responsive behavior versus like a kind of sensitivity, I guess.
Yeah. Could you look at it in relation to heart rate though, or?
Yes, that is exactly where we're going with something. I haven't done it yet, where we're kind of working on that data right now, like next week. Yeah. Exactly. Some of the data I showed you, we just used a median split. So that's not perfect either, but it's just one way to sort of divide up those who are high. So in some ways, the fact that it's a median split makes it almost more conservative because the groups aren't. So the groups might look even more different if we were to take like a really high versus really low. Yeah, there are different ways. We also, in some of these, the data look continuously. So there are different ways to do it.
Yeah.
And I'm still trying to figure out what the best way is.
Yeah, now I wonder if like also just combining different factors, like doing the psychophys on top of it.
That's sort of the direction I'm going in. It's like, could we combine psychophys and observed behavior to get a better measure? Yeah.
Really cool stuff. We're over time, but if anybody has any pressing questions, I'm sure that Dr. Green, welcome. You come to the front of the room and talking to her individually, but otherwise join me in thanking Dr. Green.